There's a certain kind of silence that only exists inside a fire station at 4 in the morning. I want you to picture it for a moment, because it was the last normal thing I ever experienced before my entire world fell apart. My name is Michael Venus. I'm 39 years old, and for the past 14 years, I've been a firefighter in Astoria, Oregon, a small fishing and logging town where the Columbia River meets the Pacific beneath a long green steel bridge stretching toward Washington. 3 years ago, I earned the rank of captain at Station 2 on Marine Drive. Our firehouse overlooked the docks, and I used to think it had the best view in all of Oregon. Before I tell you about the worst night of my life, you need to understand what was taken from me. I met my wife, Rachel, at a house party in Portland nearly 16 years ago. I was a rookie firefighter, and she was finishing nursing school at OHSU. We spent the first 20 minutes arguing over a Portland Trailblazers trade. By the end of the night, I couldn't have told you who won the argument, because all I cared about was hearing her laugh again. 4 years later, we were married at a small vineyard in the Willamette Valley. When a firefighter position opened in Astoria, Rachel was the one who convinced me to take it. She said she'd always dreamed of raising a child somewhere you could smell the ocean from the front porch. 2 years after we moved, our daughter Hannah was born. She inherited Rachel's stubborn chin and my terrible sense of direction. By the time she turned 4, she had a habit of drawing little yellow suns on everything she could find: school folders, birthday cards, even the fogged-up windows of my truck. She always said the town had too much rain, and someone had to remind the sun where to come back. Rachel worked as a labor and delivery nurse at Columbia Memorial Hospital. She could spend 16 exhausting hours helping other families welcome new babies into the world, then come home with enough energy to read Hannah 3 bedtime stories instead of 2, simply because Hannah always asked for one more, and Rachel could never refuse. I used to joke that she was spoiling our daughter. She'd just smile and tell me that one day, when Hannah was grown, I'd understand why she never said no. I laughed every time because I thought we had forever. What I didn't know, standing in that delivery room the day Hannah was born, was that I only had 6 years left with both of them. No warning, no countdown, just an ordinary life that would end without asking permission. The second Wednesday in June started like every other shift day. I left home before sunrise for my 24-hour shift. Rachel stood in the driveway wearing her robe, a mug of coffee in one hand and Hannah resting on her hip. Hannah threw both arms over her head and waved at me like she was trying to flag down an airplane. I smiled, waved back, climbed into my truck, and drove away, never imagining that simple goodbye would haunt me for the rest of my life. I remember backing out of the driveway that morning thinking life had finally settled down. Rachel's schedule at the hospital had eased up. Hannah had just lost her first tooth and proudly showed the gap to anyone willing to look. And for the first time in years, our little family felt like everything was finally falling into place. My shift was unusually quiet. We handled a few medical calls and knocked out a small kitchen fire on Commercial Street in less than 15 minutes. It was the kind of rare night when the whole crew actually sat down for a hot dinner instead of eating cold takeout between emergencies. Around 9 that evening, I called home to say goodnight. Rachel laughed as she told me Hannah had insisted on wearing her rain boots to bed because she had decided they were officially part of her pajamas. We laughed together. That was the last conversation I ever had with my wife. At 1:40 in the morning, the dispatch radio crackled to life with a report of a residential fire. I recognized the address before the dispatcher finished speaking. It was my house. I had painted that mailbox myself the summer before, while Hannah pressed her tiny yellow handprints along the bottom because she wanted it to look happier. Most of the drive is a blur. The next thing I remember is engine 2 pulling into my own front yard, and flames already pouring through the living room windows, turning the house, where we'd built our life, into an orange inferno. I tried to run inside, but my own crew stopped me. They were men I had trained, men I trusted with my life, and they held me back with everything they had. Department policy was absolute. No firefighter was ever allowed to enter a scene involving their own family. No exceptions. It was a rule I had repeated to every rookie who ever served under me. That night, I hated them for obeying it. The investigators later concluded the fire started from a faulty electrical outlet hidden behind the entertainment center. Aging wiring had likely been failing for months before finally igniting after midnight. Smoke filled the house long before anyone outside could see flames. Rachel and Hannah never woke up. The coroner told me they had passed peacefully in their sleep before the fire ever reached their bedroom. I have clung to those words ever since, because they are the only mercy that terrible night ever gave me. Standing there in full turnout gear, watching my own home burn while my crew held me back, I believed I was living through the worst moment of my life. I was wrong. The fire wasn't what nearly destroyed me. What came afterward did. My own parents would make sure of that. Kevin's wife, Amber, handled the bookkeeping for the repair shop. She also seemed to believe she should manage everyone else's opinions. She was the kind of person who could turn, "I'm just being honest," into a full-time profession. Around 4 that morning, I called my mother from outside the hospital morgue. I was still wearing half my turnout gear, and my hands were shaking so badly I dropped my phone twice before I managed to tell her that Rachel and Hannah were gone. Her first question wasn't whether I was okay. It wasn't what had happened. She asked if the funeral could be moved to the following week instead of that Saturday. For a second, I honestly thought I'd misheard her. My mind simply refused to accept what had just come out of her mouth. "We have the Alaska cruise, Michael," she said matter-of-factly. "It's been booked since February. 11 days with your brother and the kids. The deposits aren't refundable." I swallowed hard. "Mom, Rachel and Hannah are dead." "I know," she replied in the same calm voice someone might use to discuss a delayed package. "I'm just saying it would make everyone's schedule much easier if we waited a week." Everyone's schedule. I ended the call, slid down the hospital hallway wall, and sat on the floor. The chaplain who had stayed with me through the night quietly placed a hand on my shoulder without saying a word. Looking back, I think he understood there was nothing he could possibly say that would be more shocking than what I'd just heard from my own mother. Then the family group chat lit up. My father sent one short message. "So sorry, son. Terrible thing." After that, he disappeared, just as he always did whenever a conversation became uncomfortable. Kevin sent nothing but a crying emoji. The only person who had plenty to say was Amber. She typed a long message for everyone to read. "Of course, we're all devastated, but the cruise tickets are non-refundable, and the kids have been looking forward to this for months. I don't think Michael would want us to cancel a family vacation over what is, in the end, a trivial event. We'll pay our respects when we get back." A trivial event. I stood alone in the hospital parking garage reading that sentence over and over, 4 times. Every time I read it, another piece of the faith I still had in my family quietly disappeared alongside Rachel and Hannah. 2 minutes later, my mother replied with a thumbs-up emoji and a single word: "Agreed." Not one of them asked how the fire had started. Not one of them asked whether Rachel or Hannah had suffered. Not one of them asked where I was going to sleep now that my house on Alma Avenue was nothing but a burned-out shell wrapped in fire marshal's tape. The only thing they wanted to know was which weekend worked best for their vacation plans. That was all that mattered. I told them the funeral would take place that Saturday, 4 days later, whether they attended or not. Then I locked my phone, slipped it into my jacket, and didn't look at it again for the rest of the day. Sitting alone in that parking garage, with my entire world collapsing around me, I had no idea that conversation would be the last real one I'd have with my parents for almost a year. The people I thought I had grown up with were gone long before that Alaska cruise ended. The front pew at Grace Community Church had always been reserved for immediate family. The morning of Rachel and Hannah's funeral, it stayed completely empty. I told the ushers not to let anyone sit there. Some seats are earned, and mine had already been abandoned. Instead, I sat in the second row between my Uncle Carl and Rachel's closest friend, Vivian Ross. Carl, a retired Portland firefighter with 31 years on the job, drove 3 hours the moment he heard the news. Vivian came straight from an overnight shift at Columbia Memorial Hospital, still wearing the faint scent of disinfectant because stopping to change mattered less to her than being there. By the time the service began, the church was overflowing. People lined the back wall because every seat had been taken. My entire crew from Station 2 showed up in full dress blues. 2 of them even canceled family plans to be there. Nurses from Rachel's maternity ward filled several rows, many arriving in scrubs after finishing their shifts. Then Hannah's kindergarten class walked in together with their teacher, Miss Patterson. In the middle of the service, she stood up through her tears and told everyone that Hannah was the only child she'd ever taught who drew little yellow suns instead of princesses, because she believed someone had to remind the sky the sun was still there, even when the rain tried to hide it. While more than 200 people packed that small church to say goodbye to my wife and daughter, my parents, my brother Kevin, and his family were somewhere off the coast of Alaska enjoying their cruise. Their front row seats remained spotless, a silent reminder of exactly who had chosen not to come. I delivered the eulogy myself, because I couldn't trust anyone else to tell their story. I told everyone how Rachel could calm terrified new parents in the middle of the night with nothing but her voice, then somehow still find time to comfort every patient on the floor. I told them about Hannah's rain boots becoming pajamas and how convinced she was that someone had to keep track of the sunshine for the whole town. I never once mentioned the empty front pew. I didn't have to. Everyone in that church saw it, and more than once I caught people glancing toward those vacant seats before quietly looking away. After the service, Uncle Carl walked me to my truck and rested a hand on my shoulder. "Michael," he said, "they're never going to change. Stop waiting for them to become the family you deserve. I've watched your father treat people like this for 40 years. You're not the first. You're just the one who paid the highest price." 5 days after I buried my wife and daughter, my phone rang. It was my mother calling from Seattle Airport after getting off the cruise. I answered only because I was too exhausted to care who it was anymore. There was no greeting, no asking how I was holding up, just the sound of airport announcements, and my mother's voice getting straight to business. 5 days after the funeral, my mother's voice sounded exactly the way it always had when she called about an overdue utility bill. "Michael, we need to talk about the $40,000. I was sitting on the edge of the guest bed in Uncle Carl's house, the only place I had left to stay after the fire. For a moment, I honestly had no idea what she meant. "What 40,000? I asked. "The money your father and I gave you and Rachel for the house," she replied, as if I should have known immediately. "We need it back. Kevin's business is in serious trouble. The family has to pull together, and everyone needs to do their part." I couldn't speak. Rachel and Hannah had been buried only 5 days earlier. "That was a gift," I finally said. "You and Dad told us it was a gift. We used it for the down payment on the house that just burned to the ground." She didn't hesitate. "Insurance will pay for the house. You'll have money coming. We just need it sooner rather than later because of Kevin." Looking back, I realized that call wasn't the worst part. It was only the opening move. Over the next 3 months, it would grow into something far uglier, ending in front of dozens of relatives on a dock in Astoria. The calls kept coming through June and into July. Every conversation revolved around the same $40,000. "Never Rachel, never Hannah," my father called twice that first week. Both times he shifted the conversation to the money within minutes, speaking in the calm, businesslike tone of someone discussing an unpaid invoice, instead of inventing a debt 5 days after his own granddaughter's funeral. By the third week of June, Kevin finally called. Unlike our parents, he actually sounded shaken. "Michael, I told them the timing was wrong," he said. "I really did. But the shop got crushed after that storm in April. Half our equipment was ruined, and I'm drowning on the business loan Dad co-signed. If I lose the shop, he goes down with me. That's why he's pushing so hard." I closed my eyes. "Kevin, I lost my wife and my daughter. I don't even have a home anymore. I'm sleeping in Uncle Carl's guest room." There was a long silence before he answered. "I know. I'm sorry. I really am. It's just, things are falling apart over here too." I believed him. His fear was real. What wasn't real was the complete absence of compassion from the rest of my family. In those first weeks after the fire, not once did my mother, father, or brother say Rachel's name or Hannah's name unless I brought them up first. They never asked what caused the fire, whether I was sleeping, or where I planned to live. Every conversation ended up in the same place, the money. It was like water always finding the lowest point, no matter how many times you tried to fill the hole. Then, in the second week of July, my parents showed up unannounced at Uncle Carl's house while I was meeting with the insurance adjuster and trying to figure out whether rebuilding on Alma Avenue was even possible. Uncle Carl let my parents inside because, as he told me later, he couldn't bring himself to slam the door on his own brother. Judging by the look on his face, he regretted that decision within minutes. We sat around Carl's kitchen table when my mother slid a folded sheet of paper toward me. It was a copy of the $40,000 wire transfer from 4 years earlier, the date circled in red ink. "We just want something in writing," she said. "A payment plan. It doesn't have to be much. Just something to get started." I looked at the paper, then back at her. "There already is something in writing," I said. "The gift letter you and Dad signed at closing. The one the mortgage company required. It clearly says this money was a gift and that no repayment would ever be expected." My father shifted in his chair before answering. "That was just paperwork for the bank. It was never supposed to mean anything between family." I stared at them, trying to understand how two people could sit across from me only 5 weeks after I buried my wife and daughter and calmly tell me that their own signed legal document meant nothing. I didn't argue. I didn't have the strength. I simply told them I needed time to think, walked them to their car, and watched them drive away. Afterward, Uncle Carl stood quietly in the doorway and shook his head. I've never been more ashamed of my brother than I am today. By the end of July, at Vivian's urging, I started attending a grief support group that met every Tuesday evening at the community center. One night, sitting in a circle of folding chairs with 6 strangers carrying losses of their own, I finally told someone what my family had done. One woman looked at me in disbelief. "They asked you for money 5 days after the funeral, before they even asked if you were okay?" I nodded. "They never asked if I was okay. Not that day. Not once since." Saying those words out loud changed something. For the first time, I heard my own story through other people's silence, and I realized just how deeply wrong it really was. I hadn't been imagining it. I hadn't been overreacting. I had simply been surviving one heartbreaking phone call after another. By the middle of August, Kevin had repaired the storm damage and announced a grand reopening for Venus Marine Repair over Labor Day weekend. My mother called to tell me the entire family would be there and said it would mean a lot if I came. I agreed. She thought I was finally ready to make peace. What she didn't know was that I was driving to the waterfront with 2 folded sheets of paper tucked inside my jacket. Before that day was over, my family was going to see the truth in black and white, whether they wanted to or not. Venus Marine Repair sat along the Astoria waterfront with the Columbia River stretching behind it. Boats rocked gently against the docks while seagulls circled overhead like they always did. Kevin had hung string lights across the building for the reopening, and by the time I arrived, about 40 people had gathered: relatives, customers, neighbors, and even 2 firefighters from my crew who had come because they refused to let me face that day alone. About 20 minutes into the reopening, my father climbed onto an overturned equipment crate near the front counter and raised his glass. He gave a speech about family, sacrifice, and sticking together through hard times. Then he looked directly at me. "Some people," he said, "have been blessed and forgotten where those blessings came from. We gave Michael and Rachel $40,000 when they had nothing. Now that he's back on his feet, he won't help his own brother." A ripple spread through the crowd. Right on cue, Amber stepped in with that polite smile she always wore before saying something cruel. "It's really disappointing," she said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "We even missed that funeral because of family, and this is how we're repaid." She didn't repeat the exact words she'd used before, but the meaning was unmistakable. I saw several people glance at one another, uncomfortable enough to recognize what she was really implying. Every eye in the room turned toward me. My mother stood beside my father with complete confidence, already convinced she knew how this story would end. I quietly set down my paper plate and stood. I never raised my voice. 40 people expected a shouting match. Instead, I gave them silence, and somehow that silence demanded more attention than yelling ever could. "Dad," I said calmly, "you're right. You did give Rachel and me $40,000. We'll talk about that. But first, since Amber mentioned the funeral, let's talk about that instead." I reached into my jacket and unfolded the first sheet of paper onto a nearby workbench beside the cake trays. It wasn't dramatic, just a simple timeline with dates printed in black ink. I pointed to the first one. "This is the day Rachel and Hannah were buried." Then I slid my finger to the next date. "And this is the day Mom posted vacation photos from your Alaska cruise." The caption reads, "Best trip in years." I looked around the room before speaking again. "You didn't miss the funeral because of family. You skipped your own granddaughter's funeral for a cruise." Then, 5 days later, you came home and demanded money from the man who had just buried his wife and daughter. The room fell completely silent. My father's mouth opened, but no words came out. My mother's confidence disappeared in an instant. Kevin, cornered by the truth, reacted the only way he knew how. "You're twisting everything," he shouted, stepping toward me. "The shop is drowning, Michael. I've got 2 kids, a mortgage, and a business that's barely surviving. And you're standing here waving paperwork instead of helping your own brother when he needs you most." I let him finish. I didn't interrupt once. Everyone in that room deserved to hear exactly what he believed before they heard what I had to say next. When Kevin finally ran out of words, I reached into my jacket one last time and pulled out the second sheet of paper. It was the original gift letter my parents had signed 4 years earlier at the title company, the document our mortgage lender required before approving our loan. In plain language, with both of their signatures at the bottom, it stated that the $40,000 was a gift, not a loan, and that no repayment would ever be expected. I placed it beside the timeline. "You both sign this," I said, "in front of a notary. It says, in your own handwriting, that this money was a gift. So you can ask me for help the way any family member can ask for help. But you can't rewrite history and send me a bill for something you legally declared was never a loan." No one said a word. Then a folding chair scraped across the floor. Vivian Ross slowly stood up. Rachel's friend had driven all the way there that morning without me even asking. "Everything Michael said is true," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "I was at the funeral, and I still have the cruise photos Linda posted the very next day. I saved them because I couldn't believe what I was seeing." The mood shifted almost instantly. An aunt I hadn't spoken to in years reached for the gift letter to read it herself. A cousin leaned over her shoulder. One by one, people stopped looking at me and started looking at the documents. 20 minutes earlier, they had been ready to believe I was the selfish son refusing to help his family. Now they were staring at undeniable proof, and the silence in that room said more than any apology could. My mother quietly whispered my name, "Michael." It sounded less like a statement than a plea, as though she still hoped I would fold the papers away, smile for the family photo, and pretend the last 3 months had never happened. That version of me no longer existed. Kevin stood motionless near the counter. The anger had vanished from his face, replaced by something far more honest. Fear. For the first time I could see it clearly. He was terrified of losing his business, his home, and everything he had built for his children. "Michael," he said softly, "I'm scared." I believed him. It was the most honest thing anyone in my family had said since the fire. For a brief moment, I felt the old instinct to protect my little brother, the same instinct that had made me carry him on my shoulders at county fairs and stand between him and school bullies when we were kids. Then I realized something. In 3 months, he had never once said Rachel's name, never once said Hannah's. Every conversation had been about what he stood to lose, never about what I already had. I folded the papers, slipped them back into my jacket, and looked him in the eye. "I truly hope you figure this out, Kevin," I said. "But this time, you're going to have to do it without me." Then I turned and walked onto the dock. The breeze coming off the Columbia River carried the smell of salt water and low tide, and for the first time since the fire, I felt like I could finally take a full breath again. Venus Marine Repair closed for good the following spring, less than a year after that reopening. I didn't hear it from my parents or Kevin. A cousin mentioned it during one of the occasional phone calls we still have. By then I was surprised by how little I felt. There was no satisfaction, no anger, no guilt, just nothing. And eventually I realized that kind of peace didn't need an apology. The day of that Labor Day gathering was the last day I ever spoke to my parents. There wasn't a dramatic confrontation or one final speech. I simply stopped answering their calls. One by one, they stopped making them. The silence that followed became the calmest part of my life. I held on to the people who had actually stood beside me. Uncle Carl comes over for dinner almost every Sunday, and we rarely mention my father anymore. Neither of us needs to. Vivian and I still talk nearly every week, usually about Rachel. I get to say her name to someone who loved her too, and neither of us has to pretend it hurts any less. My crew at Station 2 never treated me differently after everything that happened. The only change was one I didn't notice at first. Someone I still don't know who painted a tiny yellow sun inside the cab of engine 2, no bigger than a silver dollar, right where I'd see it every time I climbed into the truck. No note. No explanation. They knew I wouldn't need one. I rebuilt my home on the same lot on Alma Avenue. It's smaller now, built with new wiring and inspected twice by a firefighter from a neighboring department who refused to take a penny for his time. From the old house, only one thing truly survived. Inside a fireproof box in my new garage is one of Hannah's drawings. A bright yellow sun with far too many rays, exactly the way only a 6-year-old would draw it. I'll keep it for the rest of my life. Nearly a year after the fire, I visited Rachel and Hannah's graves just after sunrise. I brought a handful of wildflowers I'd picked along Highway 101, the same flowers that bloom every summer whether anyone plants them or not. The grass was still wet with dew, and the morning fog drifted quietly across the cemetery. I stood there for a long time without saying much. Sometimes just being there is enough. My phone buzzed once in my pocket. I looked at the screen and realized it was no longer a call I needed to answer. For the first time since losing them, letting it ring didn't hurt. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and stayed where I was. Over the past year, I've learned that family isn't defined by the people who share your last name. Family is made up of the people who stand beside you when there's nothing to gain. And the people who only show up when they need something have already told you exactly who they are. That's what this year left me with. A funeral my own parents considered less important than a vacation, a granddaughter they chose not to say goodbye to, and a gift they tried to turn into a debt 5 days after I buried the two people I loved most. Those memories will never leave me, but neither will the people who chose to stay.